In this presentation, we're going to be talking about the disadvantages or challenges to an ethics of prima facie duties. We'll start out by reviewing the ethic of prima facie duties, then we'll turn to the disadvantages, including worries revolving around how to resolve moral conflict, how we can gain moral knowledge, how we can maybe try to resolve moral disagreement, worries about dogmatism, and worries about rationalization of one's previous views. So remember, a prima facie duty is an excellent, non-absolute, permanent moral reason to do or refrain from doing something. Now, Ross puts forward a list of 7 prima facie duties as a starting point for thinking about a foundation of morality. There's beneficence, the duty to do good for others. Self-improvement, the duty to do good for oneself. The duty of non-maleficence, to prevent harm to others or oneself. A duty of fidelity, to keep our promises, being faithful to our word and telling the truth. Duty of reparations, to repair harm or past wrongs that we've done. A duty of gratitude, to show appreciation and appropriately acknowledge the benefits other people give us. And a duty of justice, to make sure that virtue is rewarded and vice is punished, that people get what they deserve. Those first 3, remember, are consequentialist sort of duties to make the world better and avoid making it worse. And the last 4 are sort of deontological, Kantian sort of duties. They're looking to the past to give us reasons about how we are obligated to act now in virtue of those past actions. Now, those are the prima facie duties, but the final all things considered duty, or what's morally right in a particular situation, is a little bit more difficult, since multiple prima facie duties might be competing with one another in a particular situation. So your final all things considered duty is the course of action for which you have the strongest moral reasons when you're taking into account all of these relevant factors, when you're weighing all these sort of prima facie duties against one another in that particular situation. So one of the main disadvantages for Ross is, what are we supposed to do when these prima facie duties conflict with one another? Because sometimes doing justice is going to come into conflict with doing good and preventing harm. So to see this disadvantage, it's best to compare this to Kant or utilitarianism. If Kant's theory is right, justice always takes priority over preventing harm, and so we know what we should do. If utilitarians are right, justice never takes priority. So doing good always takes priority. And so yet again, we would know what to do when these conflicts come up. But if Ross is right, sometimes justice takes priority, sometimes it doesn't. And so how do we figure out which duty we should be following? So Ross denies that there's any absolute moral rules, remember. Every rule might sometimes be broken. Even the rule that says do to make the world overall better. That rule must sometimes be broken in favor of justice, but sometimes not. But when? So the prima facie duties, yes, they are always morally important. But how important? According to Ross, that depends on the specific situation. Yet there are no guidelines we can use from case to case to help us know when a prima facie duty takes precedence over a competing duty. And that's because Ross thinks you can't put a ranking on these. You can't say, well, justice is the most important, and then keeping your promise is the second most important. So he doesn't think you can do that kind of ranked list. He says how important these duties are changes from situation to situation. So all you can do is look at the context and do your best to weigh them. And so in those situations of conflict, it doesn't look like there's anything we could appeal to give us advice about how to resolve the conflict. But that's one thing we want a moral theory to do, to give us advice in those tricky situations. All right, so this is also related to some worries about moral knowledge. So one of the things we want to know from a moral theory is, how can we know what the right thing to do is? Where do we get our knowledge about morality? The utilitarian seems to have one of the most natural explanations of moral knowledge. So utilitarians are oftentimes thought of as empiricists, this idea that we get our knowledge from experience. And this is because, according to the utilitarian, what makes actions right or wrong are the consequences. Well, how do we learn what the consequences are or results of our actions are? Well, through experience. We do things and we see the results, and then we think if we were to do that thing again in the future, we'd get similar results. So we can use our experience and even scientific experiments to learn about cause and effect. So what causes what? About what the likely results or consequences of certain actions would be. All right, so we can learn through experience that breaking your promise tends to hurt the feelings of the person you broke the promise to. The problem is that it isn't clear how we gain moral knowledge on Ross's view, because according to Ross, the importance of these prima facie duties like fidelity or justice has nothing to do with their consequences. And so it doesn't look like I can appeal to my past experiences about the results. It doesn't look like I can do any experiment to help me decide whether or not promise keeping is of intrinsic moral importance or not. So there's really two challenges here for Ross. How do we gain knowledge of the prima facie duties? And how do we gain knowledge of the morally right action or our final duties in a particular situation? So Ross defends the following views regarding moral knowledge. And so you need to think, are these plausible views or not? So what looks more plausible? Something like the utilitarian view that appeals to experience and empiricism, or Ross's view. So regarding prima facie duties, let's focus on those first. According to Ross, these can be known a priori. The idea is these beliefs are justified not by our experience, but by our faculty of reason or some kind of moral intuition that we have. So we have our sensory experiences, but then we also have these other faculties of reason or intuition. And the idea is, so he thinks our moral knowledge is kind of like mathematical knowledge. It's not like the physical sciences. It's like mathematical knowledge where you just think about the ideas very carefully, and that's where your knowledge comes from. So if you understand what the word 2 means and what the word 3 means, and you understand what addition is, you can just think about the idea of 2 plus 3 and the idea of 5, and you'll have a sort of intuition to see that those things have to be equal. I don't have to do any scientific experiment to find out that 2 plus 3 equals 5. I can just think about it very hard. And because of this, if this is how we know prima facie duties, it looks like just like we can be absolutely certain that 2 plus 3 equals 5, Ross thinks we can also be absolutely certain that the prima facie duties are of intrinsic moral importance. That, say, keeping a promise is intrinsically morally important. We can know that with certainty. According to Ross, though, how do we know our final all things considered duties, since even if you know with certainty what the prima facie duties are, you still need to weigh them against one another in a particular situation to figure out what your final duty is? Well, he says here, we must start our moral thinking about a specific situations by clearly grasping the prima facie duties. So that is, to try to figure out what the right thing to do is, the first thing you need to do is figure out, well, which prima facie duties apply to that situation. Make sure you have a clear understanding of the situation you're in. But once you answer such questions, once you determine whether a promise has been made, whether there's justice to be done, what kind of good consequences you could or could not get, once you answer those questions, you're on your own. You need to bring your experience and insight to bear, your intuition, on the details of a given case. The bad news is that there's no fixed or mechanical procedure that tells us how to weigh the prima facie duties against one another. So knowledge in any particular situation about the morally right action requires using our experience and intuition and possibly looking to maybe moral exemplars. So think of examples of really good people and think, what would they do in that situation? And that might give you advice. But according to Ross, this knowledge in a particular situation of what the right thing to do is never certain. And it's never more than our best educated belief, because there is no determinate way to figure out which prima facie duty is the most important in that situation. So those ideas about moral knowledge also lead to a worry about moral disagreement. And this comes in two forms. So what should we do when people disagree with us about the prima facie duties? So let's say I think that, say, gratitude is a prima facie duty, but someone else says, no, I don't think that is one. And what can we do when people disagree with us about how to balance the prima facie duties against one another when we're trying to figure out our final duty? Now, so to someone who thought about justice, for instance, and failed to see its moral importance, so failed to see that it's a prima facie duty, Ross could only do one thing. He would invite that person to think more carefully about what justice really is. And the idea is because the only way to know what the prima facie duties are is by thinking about those ideas themselves, using your thought and reason and intuition. And so all you can do to try to get someone to agree with you is ask them to think about it harder. And you can do that in a couple ways, though. You could still give them examples to consider. You could draw analogies to other cases that seem to reveal the importance of justice. You could distinguish justice from other possibly related notions to make sure they're not confusing it with something else. Make sure that they're thinking about it clearly. You could try to ensure that particular beliefs opposing the importance of justice are not based on an error. Make sure they don't have any false beliefs. But suppose that the person does all of this and they're thinking very carefully about justice, but they're still unconvinced that it's sort of intrinsically and fundamentally morally important. According to Ross, at that point, moral discussion just comes to an end, and the only verdict to render is that that other person is wrong, and there's nothing you can do to show them that they're wrong. So you're just stuck there where you can't resolve that disagreement. Now, one thing Ross might say here is, yes, this is unfortunate, and it kind of sucks, but it can happen in other cases too. Imagine I say, look, I know that there cannot be a round circle or a square circle. Sorry, of course there can be a round circle. Imagine someone says, I say, there cannot be a square circle. And someone else says, I think that there could. Well, at first I might sort of try to say, what do you mean you think that there could? You know what the word square means, right? And they're like, yeah, it has four equal sides, sort of perpendicular, all connected by right angles. I say, okay, you know what a circle is, right? They say, yeah, it's a figure that is sort of where all points are equidistant from a sort of single point. And I say, okay, so it looks like you got your definitions right. Can you imagine a square circle? They're like, yeah. Like, hold on. You're not imagining like something that like has four sides with sort of rounded sort of edges and corners there, because that wouldn't be a square circle. That would just be something that looks kind of like a square. And they say, no, that's not what I'm imagining. I'm imagining something that is both a square and a circle at the same time. At that point, I'm just going to say, I don't know how to talk to you anymore because you're just wrong, and I don't know how to show you that you're wrong. There's nothing else I can do. We're just sort of stuck. Again, I don't think that means I don't know that there can't be square circles. It just means I don't know how to show them that they're wrong. So Ross might think maybe that happens again in the case of the morality of prima facie duties. Similarly, so that's about prima facie duties. What about the all things considered duty in a particular situation? Well, imagine someone disagrees with you about the morality of a particular case. What could you do? Well, similarly, you could attempt to make sure that neither of you is confused about the details of the case. Make sure that the other person, maybe one of you knows that a promise was made and the other one doesn't. And then maybe once you find that out, maybe then you would agree. Or you could attempt to draw analogies to other cases. But remember, there's no fixed procedure for weighing prima facie duties against one another. So, if you and another person, if you get clear about all the details and facts about the case, and you agree about what all the prima facie duties are, but you weigh the prima facie duties differently in this particular situation, then it seems there's nothing you could do to figure out who is correct and who's incorrect, who made the right weighing and who made the wrong weighing. And remember, Ross believes that there are objective answers to these claims. It's not up to you to decide what's morally wrong. It's up to you to decide what you believe. But what you believe could be mistaken, and what's right doesn't depend upon what you believe. So Ross attempts to respond to this by saying, look, we're in a similar situation even in the sciences. He says, look, oftentimes there are theories that can both explain the data, and scientists disagree about which theory is better supported. Because maybe one theory is simpler than another, but maybe one has more sort of explanatory power. There's all these different virtues of scientific theories that you have to weigh against one another. And different scientists might weigh those virtues. So one scientist might think that simplicity is much more important in a particular situation, and another scientist thinks that a simple theory is much less important in that situation. If they agree about all the data, and they agree about like all the math and things like that, but they just disagree about how to weigh these different virtues against one another, it looks like there's nothing we could do to resolve that disagreement. At least given our current evidence. And so you might just say, look, maybe our inability to resolve rational disagreements is just something we had to learn to live with. There's things we can do to try to resolve disagreements at first, but at some point you reach a scenario where there's just nothing further you can do. But this also leads into worries about dogmatism. So there's the idea that maybe this sort of ethic of prima facie duties would lead us to become dogmatic in our moral ideas, a kind of sort of stubbornness or closed-mindedness to other people's positions. So each of us must rely on our own individual intuition to gain moral knowledge in two ways on Ross's view. We need to rely on our intuition to form beliefs about what the prima facie duties are. We need to rely on our own intuition for determining what we believe is the correct way to weigh the prima facie duties against one another in a particular situation. However, you might think it looks dogmatic to trust our own intuitions over those who disagree with us, who have different intuitions. How can we insist that we're right and they're wrong? Lastly, one worry that your book doesn't mention is that the ethic of prima facie duties seems to make it maybe easy to rationalize our own beliefs no matter what they are. So the idea here is that Ross's view has the danger of leading us into a situation where we identify prima facie duties and we claim that they're the most important, not because they really are, but rather just because those prima facie duties support or confirm what we already believe. So Ross's theory might essentially enable us to engage in a kind of moral confirmation bias. The idea here is, look, we all think about a situation, we think, I think this is right. And then the worry is that, and now someone disagrees, well, I want to sort of decide, well, am I right? There's so many competing prima facie duties that it looks like I could just say, well, I think this is right. And now I'm just going to go find the prima facie duties that support the thing that I already believe. At which point it looks like we're just sort of rationalizing the sort of opinions we already had. And it doesn't give us any ability to correct mistakes that we made. Since whatever beliefs we have, we can always find some reason to support them. And that might look irrational, since we're just sort of making up our reasons to support the thing we already believe, instead of letting the argument lead us to a conclusion. All right, so that's it for this video. That actually completes our look at normative ethical theories. So we have utilitarianism, we have Kantianism, and then we have the ethic of prima facie duties that sort of tries to find a middle ground. All right, next week we're going to begin the section of the course where we're going to consider a variety of applied ethical issues. So we're going to look at specific ethical issues and try to apply some of these ethical ideas to figure out what would be right or wrong in those particular kinds of examples. See you then. Bye-bye.